All right, we are live.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi, everybody. All
We're
right.
not dead, we're alive.
Yeah. I'm dead. What's that? I just got an email. I'm dead. Now what?
I just got that email too. Weird.
Who's that email from?
That was an Integral Life email.
Yeah.
It's promo for this course they're doing on
I
Oh,
saw that too.
approaches to conscious dying or integral dying or something like that. Oh, I have a train coming. Let me mute myself.
Oh, you're near trains too.
oh, we're getting some.
So how do I get the chat back now? Chat, there it is. Okay, on the left-hand side, screen share, showcase, Q&A, control room, add apps. Where is everybody?
I'm here.
Whoa. Have you done the reading, Zach? Can't hear you. You're muted.
Oh, Dee. I think your whatchamacallit, your video. You have a video feed on at the same time. I think that's correct, right, Marco? You have the YouTube stream still playing? Because I hear our voices
No.
talking.
No, I don't. I don't hear it.
I don't hear it either, actually.
Hold on a second. That was me.
All right.
Nice. Sorry, guys.
Well, maybe we're not going to have a huge turnout. Maybe
Maybe not. Maybe
yes.
not tonight. We'll see, though. I mean, everyone kind of logged on a little bit later, the first 10 minutes or so. But yeah, okay. I guess we can just kind of jump in here. Chapter 4, Mutations as an Integral Phenomenon. This was quite a chapter. There's so much in here. It's really dense. There's a lot of tables, which is kind of different than we've been encountering throughout this book so far. And a very careful analysis of language and linguistics, which I found to be very interesting. But maybe we can just begin at the beginning and sort of look at this kind of important distinction Gebser's mentioning here with that first table on page 117 when he's giving us the structures of consciousness laid out in their space and time relationships. And he's mentioned this before earlier in the book about the dimensioning of each structure and how it adds a dimension of origin or of reality to our experience, zero-dimensional, 1, 2, 3, and 4. And he's mentioned the pre-perspectival, unperspectival, and aperspectival, and perspectival. But seeing it laid out like this, I thought was kind of interesting. And again, he's very careful in these opening paragraphs to kind of say, it's not a necessarily directional because there's a kind of remoteness from origin that occurs as you go along. Even though you're increasing in dimensionality, how did he describe it? A reification of space, right? Or a reification of the physical. He mentioned something to that degree in the first few pages. And then in the second table, he adds another layer, which again he's mentioned before: the triangle and the circle for the mental and the mythical, and then the point for the magic, and then the integral he introduces as the sphere, and he brings in the word, as Marco and I were mentioning before, diaphaneity, transparency in parentheses, and he also describes his properties as presentiating or diaphanous or rendering whole. So he's kind of really giving us a little bit more structure finally, and he's very careful again that he's noting that this is very mental. This is for our convenience to kind of understand this, and going forward, we must be, because we are, almost inescapably mental. Let's at least be aware of it. So he kind of remarks this a couple of times that this is just for our ability to kind of grasp hold of it in a very mental kind of spatial kind of way, or grasping this. But did anybody have any kind of initial reactions or experiences or challenges with this chapter just off the bat? Does anybody want to share their experience with it? And Dai, if you want to just mention, feel free to tie in what you're reading as well with what we're talking about, or just your experience of Gebser and reading him in general and what the experience has been like. You're more than welcome to chime in.
Well, I'm happy to chime in. It was a hard chapter. It was I had to. I think I've mentioned this before, but I am going through this process of intensification. I'm feeling a process of intensification occurring personally or existentially, like as I'm reading the book. Partly because it's a challenge to read. It's a book that I think needs to be read slowly and carefully. And part of the nature of my life right now is that I have many commitments, many things to do, and so like the time aspect is very, is real for me in a way that directly relates to my experience, but then also comes in the text itself. Right? Like we're exploring what it might mean and what it does mean to have a different experience of time, right? To have this integrated experience of time, of course, at least myself, I feel time is very fragmented, and I think that between different screens, between different commitments, between different relationships, and so forth, time, our experience of time tends to be fragmented. Right, now I say our, so that's just to kind of just to generalize it a little bit, but it's something that's very present for me, and so I stayed up all night reading this. I was telling you that earlier, Jeremy, and found that I had to really be, I don't know, like kind of like raise the energy a level, to just be really present with it, because he's going so carefully, turn by turn, almost like kind of picking apart these strands of thought and these linguistic strands to kind of get to these core meanings that he wants to bring out. One of the weird things for me about the chapter, just to throw a random reflection in there, is that the whole time he's talking about measure and mass, and he's wanting to. It's almost there are all these preliminary remarks, digressions into like how root words work, for example. Like, why is it that two words who share the same root can have opposite meanings? And like, how does that look from the perspective of, or from in the world space of the different structures of consciousness? So from a rational perspective, it's because they're opposed to each other. There's a duality, right? From a mythical perspective, there's more of a polarity. From a magic perspective, there's more of a unity that comes in, where they could kind of sort of replace each other. But from the archaic, they're unified already. They're kind of priorly unified. And to go down that rabbit hole, from our sort of abstract understanding of a word, like take these words measure and mass, and then to kind of go down and try to experience that, from the different structures. I think that's what he's like I think that's what the chapter does. That's like what he's doing in the chapter. Is that he's taking you into an experience of this like abyss that the words are, because it goes down into this wholeness that ultimately kind of empties into the archaic, right? So like what's the root that it comes from? He's taking you into that, and I think it takes you into a kind of a darkness, like an obscurity. And it's, for me at least, it was hard. It was difficult to understand like why we were going there, or what was really where we were really going in the chapter. But then where I think it comes out, and what I think he's doing is he's going into the archaic, and he's going into kind of the wholeness and the root presence of words, or the root meanings of words. It's hard even to call them meanings at that, because meaning is like this mental concept. It's not even a meaning. There's like the feeling quality to it, right? There's the essence quality to it. Because then what that does is it creates that diaphaneity, like that transparency, and we, I think, can begin to sense like what he's meaning by that, what he's eliciting through this exploration. And so for me, I think one of my favorite parts of the chapter were the passages where he begins kind of bringing the origin up, or bringing the origin out, like into the mental structure that we're in, like in these charts and in these explications. But then one step beyond that, I think, is where he sort of starts, where he leaves it, and where the chapter kind of ends up. So there's like this going into a darkness, and there's going into like these seeming paradoxes as to the language and the power of language. That's the other piece of it. It's like language has this power that we don't acknowledge if we see it in flat, abstract terms. And then bringing that sense of the transparency, or the feeling, being, sensing of the wholeness, as bringing that out, I think, out of that exploration. But it's also, I'll stop after this, it's also it's a preliminary. Like this chapter and the next 3 chapters, they're caveats. Like he's setting things up for part 2, it seems. And he says that at one point, and he talks about the chapters that are coming up next, and how they're kind of clarifying certain potential misunderstandings that you might have, so that everything is like as clear as possible, to let the integral itself speak, let that itself become manifest. So yeah, it was a tough chapter, but it was really like a rewarding experience to read.
Yeah, I mean, his section 2 in the chapter is a digression on the unity of primal words. I had no idea what he was talking about, but as I went through it, it's kind of interesting, because he's kind of putting forward a kind of integral etymology, or sort of integral understanding of language, where the play of these words and their root meanings, and how one is more complementary and the other is more polar, or a thing and its opposite in the mirror. The mirror of the word is, like, he's talking about leg, or lek, and kel, and he's reversing them. But by going through that history of the word, in a way, he's kind of going through in like a micro form. He's going through what he did with the structures of consciousness. He's saying, like, look, this word in its original form, the root word, had this ambiguity to it, where things were kind of sort of continuous with each other and had multiple meanings. And then as you go along, they become more polarized, and then eventually more rationalized in the contemporary forms of our language. So it no longer means that sort of same thing, but he's basically saying even our words have this integrality of the structures within them, which I thought was really cool. In page 123, he talks about, he says, every word, after all, is not only a concept or affixed on or attributed over, are equivalent in writing. It is also an image and thus mythical, a sound and thus magic, a root and thus archaic, and thus by virtue of this root meaning still present from origin. So just right there, he was just saying, language itself has the structures of consciousness sort of presentiating, to borrow from him, kind of through their history, and because of that, you can kind of divest from them certain elements and certain aspects. They can come forward if you focus on the root. So I guess I appreciate it. I kind of kind of marvel at his carefulness with language here, because he's going forward and saying the reason why we're so careful about language is because language itself has all of these aspects to it. When we're using it, we don't even realize how all these structures are coming forth, or how we're leaning on the magical or mythical element of language, or that kind of thing. Our origin is sort of present in our language as well. And so I just thought that was kind of a beautiful way to understand the evolution of language and linguistics and etymology, and it was pretty neat. Beyond me to some degree. I don't think about language in that way, even though I'm a writer. For shame, I guess. But it was still very fascinating, and it helped kind of, again, like you're saying, as a caveat, sort of set the stage and set the prepare us for the whole other section of the book. And in some ways kind of go back and kind of explain to us what he was doing with the whole first section, his carefulness with the language, and going to the roots, and kind of basically is explaining why he went to the roots so often, and what that meant, and how the sort of movement and the shifting of language kind of describes the shifting of consciousness. And I think another writer who's really good in this regard is probably Owen Barfield, and his book Saving the Appearances, and he has another book that's can't remember the name of it at the moment, but he kind of also goes into this sort of evolution or transformations of language, and what that means about phenomenology and how we relate to time and space in the world. So there's a whole thing here that could just be its own study that we can come back to and look at. And so I echo your feelings here that I kind of want to reread this chapter, Marco, like maybe during the break week, just because I feel like there's so much. It's so packed, it's so dense that it would be good to give it a little bit more time. So yeah, if anybody else wants to chime in, please do. But another interesting thing, going a little bit back to page 118, he's talking, because we're talking about language and like the movement from unity of language and so on, but he's talking about in terms of the transformations of these structures. He's being careful now to sort of distinguish. I think this is a good point, a very important point. He says in qualitative terms, then the expanding consciousness reduces its own system of interrelationships. Unity is only a reduced wholeness, yet an inceptual consciousness in man is possible only once this unity has been achieved. So he kind of builds up to this kind of strange pitting one statement, and then it seems contrary to the other statement. But yeah, he's basically kind of describing that as we go along in history, and as these new dimensions and new structures of consciousness emerge, there's a kind of non-holonic nature to them, if that makes sense, in the sense that like they're not just building on each other. It's not transcend and include, but it's not regression either. And he's kind of like putting that forward, these two things. Like it's not just development, and it's not regression. Yet there's still some transformation and restructuration happening through all of these structures. So I don't know. I don't know if I'm articulating it right or if that makes sense, but I thought that was a really interesting point. And he brings it up multiple times throughout this chapter. So he has here, the increase of dimension by which consciousness gains extent and scope is inversely proportional to the qualitative character of the individual structures, which undergo in each instance a reduction or diminution of value or intensity. The incrementation of consciousness does not correspond to an increase within the relationship to the whole, even if that were possible, but rather to a lessening or weakening of this relationship. And that's the part I just wrote as a note, non-holonic, because he's saying as we go in these dimensions, it's a decreasing relationship to the whole rather than an increasing one, which I guess we've assumed, as is the popular narrative, not just in Ken Wilber's work, but in many writings and in sort of popular narratives of evolution and sort of the evolution of consciousness, and just the scientific theories about how we're smarter than other creatures and that kind of thing, that there's a kind of gain, that there's a inclusivity, that there's a kind of accruement at the top. We have these really complex brains, so there's an increase in complexity. Perhaps that's not uniform to the whole transformation. Perhaps we've lost certain things, and in this case, Gebser is saying off the bat that we're losing a relationship to the whole as we go along. So I'm going to stop rambling. If anybody wants to chime in with their own their own insights about this chapter.
I actually skipped the digression because I knew I wasn't going to finish the chapter if I read that section. So thanks for the. I'll now reread it. I'll now read it. Yeah, I think I get what you're saying, but I'm not sure I have anything to contribute at this point. All of these structures are present in me and in my relationships all of the time. Is that a basic kind of generalization?
I think that's where he's. I mean, there's maybe a couple ways to respond to that. One is, I think that's what he's saying about that's part of the reason for the title of this chapter. Mutations as an integral phenomena is that it's in a different maybe way of approaching that word integral, because sometimes we think of it as a thing or as a stage or as a structure into itself. But he's talking about the mutations and which becomes the co-presence of all the structures together as itself the integral phenomena. So or an integral phenomena. And so what I understood from you, Dai, is that that's exactly how you experience it. That you feel you experience the magic and the mythic and the mental as all being present in your being, and that you can understand, or you could relate to the text, or you could relate to your world in that way. Is that?
Yeah, I think, like, attempting to ground it for myself. I was in the Wilbur reading group a couple of Wednesday nights ago, and one person was hogging the conversation, and I was aware of that. Then somebody invited those of us who hadn't spoken yet to speak up, and I was just busting to, find a way in. And the person who'd been hogging the conversation, as I started to speak, and I was attempting to talk about Gebser, from my very elementary knowledge, and so I was finding it hard to put it all into my own mental structure, but linking it also to where the group had been around all sorts of these kinds of issues. And this person kept interrupting me, and I burst, "Shut up!" And I think that's the kind of, the tribal in me. Like, I didn't think I'm going to tell this person to shut up. It just happened to be there in my mental structure, in my, well, not wrong use of mental there, but in the being that I am, I was the annoyance volcanoed out.
Mm-hmm.
And I felt, it was inappropriate. And later I apologized, and he's big enough, resilient enough to take it. But yeah, it is kind of like, in our present world, we have all of these civilizations. We have archaic and magic and mythic and and we have the emergent as well.
So how did it feel when you said "shut up"?
Felt good. And I think it shifted the whole night, because they were constantly putting it outside of their experience. And from my tuning in to these hangouts, the link back to how does this actually feel, how does this work in our everyday relationships, is all important. And so that stopped people talking about things that weren't actually part of their everyday lives, and start, like, we'd had a meditation at the beginning of this session, and it took people back to where we were then, rather than, constantly pushing the boundaries. Something like that.
So what do you or what does anyone think of this idea that Gebser proposes, that as these new structures emerge, as these mutations occur, that there's a distancing from origin? that and going back to what you were talking about, Jeremy, he talks about the loss and the gain, and how something is gained and something is lost with each mutation. And he's clear that that's a mental way of looking at it. That's not where he ultimately wants to land in his discussion. But one of the ways he frames that loss and gain is that there's a gain in dimensions, there's a gain in perspectives, there's a gain in capacities or powers or strengths is sometimes how he talks about them. But then there's a loss of a relationship to wholeness, or a loss of a relationship to origin. And while he says that, he also says that origin nonetheless is present always. I think that if there's a kind of line of critique that might come in at Gebser's thought here, it might be there. That would be like one vector of a just questioning that I think I would have, and that I've heard others venture. The sense that you can even get away from origin, or that you are kind of separating and distancing yourself from something. Is that just another example of dualistic thinking? Is that just not recognizing a unity that's already there, or is it something that's phenomenologically actual? Is it something that really is the case?
I think you hit the nail on the head with the way you described it. But I can't remember exactly what you said. But it has to do with, like, you're not getting away from origin as much as that your relationship with origin is different. So we start merged with origin, right? There's nothing other than origin, in a certain sense. I don't understand exactly what Gebser means by origin. I have and that's a line of critique I have, or at least a line of questioning. I get confused about whether he's talking about, like, this unconscious, unrealized, like, sense, or just like a undifferentiated, right? There's a difference between unconscious and undifferentiated, right? In my mind, at least. Anyway, I'm digressing. But so to me, it's an identity thing, right? Like, I got away from origin whenever I disidentified with origin, and I identified with other structures or aspects of my consciousness. And I also think that explains why, as new structures come online, other structures seem to disappear, because I'm solely identifying with a particular structure and not recognizing all the other structures arising with me and relating to my current structure. Even though they're always there, they never disappear. I'm just not identifying or paying attention to them. And to a certain sense, they do disappear because we can repress them. Like when I was like really mental, when I was really rational, like I had lost touch with my feelings, right? When I lost touch, when I was like really feeling oriented, I had lost touch with my body. Like I was just feeling. I literally couldn't feel my body. And when I was mental, I literally couldn't experience my feelings. They were like repressed. And so bringing it into like the integral, getting back to identifying with origin, all that stuff starts coming back online, and I can actually see my mental formations in their relation to my feeling and in the relation to my body all at once, simultaneously. I don't know if that helps at all, or it makes any sense even.
Yeah, no, it totally makes sense, and I think it relates back to what Dai was saying too. Like that shut up was repressed, right?
Yeah,
and it became an anxiety, right? It became a perturbance, that kind of like shook the structures that were kind of holding the conversation in place, right? Kind of keeping it in a certain dynamic, but then ultimately it couldn't be held back anymore. It just broke through, it just. Yeah. And then by doing so, shifted the dynamics, shifted this sort of patterning or the structuration of the conversation. Speaking of which, we've, I think, just had somebody a little bit in shadowed join. Is that Donna?
Hey, Donna. Oh, we can't hear you. Oh, you can't hear us either. Oh no. Okay, we'll try to help you out.
Being in shadow, outside of awareness.
So, speaking to your point, Zach, I'm gonna leave a message for Donna in a second. But
Okay.
Speaking to your point, Zach, I think it's interesting later in the chapter that Gebser mentions that to the degree in which we can manifest or concretize integrality is the degree to which we are fulfilling our humanity. So there's an implication that we're not actually being fully human without all of the structures kind of coming online. I think that's a kind of interesting perspective about what it means to be integral. It's nothing beyond our actual humanity, but in a way, in a full expression of it, rather than a fragmentary expression of it. I see Dee is mentioning there seems to be a difference between unity and wholeness.
Yeah, there is one sentence, and I've lost it, but I got the sense that we can strive for a kind of unity, whether it's unity of being or unity as in community. But origin is actually the wholeness, and undifferentiated is the word we've used. So, yeah.
We have another comment actually from someone who's not live with us, Catherine Shelton. Natalie just sent me her question. And Catherine's asking, how can Gebser transcend or escape the narrative, which is a rational construct? It's an interesting question. I don't know if anybody wants to take a stab at that, but...
Can you say it again, please, Jeremy?
Sure. How can Gebser transcend or escape the narrative, which is a rational construct? I think there's a couple layers to that. Catherine, if you mean just sort of narrative in general, like going to from something or moving away from origin or to unity, I think there's an interesting, you're right that there's a rational aspect to it, a mental aspect to it, and there's a directedness. We talked about that last couple days ago with the mental and the right and the richt. We were describing sort of a direction. But then there's another aspect to narrative too, which is more cyclical and circular. Joseph Campbell and the sort of mythic narrative, because there's to some degree all of this is sounding very Joseph Campbell-esque. Moving away from origin, returning to origin is this kind of hero's journey at one level or one aspect of understanding. So I think there's a couple of different dimensions to the narrative. Which isn't just direction, but movement and circles and cycles. So that's another element to it as well. I don't know if anybody else wants to chime in.
I just want to say one thing. It's hard to put into words, right? Like how to transcend the narrative. I know what the experience of it's like, and I can do my best at describing the experience. But I don't know if I can other people have it's almost like something you have to experience for yourself. The best way I can put it though is when I hear my narrative inside my head, sometimes it's not all that's inside my head. There's space surrounding it. Like I am hearing it. I am not it. If that makes any sense. That's the best I got.
Well, it's interesting because in some of these little tables these little charts that Gebser has in this chapter, I'm trying to find the one that I'm thinking of, where he's talking about sort of forms of articulation, forms of realization and thought. I don't know if that's the one or the second to last one on page 148. he introduces a new word here, I think, under integral, etiologeme, and descriptions of it as divinity, thenaresis, which is another new word he's introducing, diaphany. And then forms of assertion or articulation, he uses virition, which elsewhere he describes as sort of being truth, or just kind of being within truth, which to me, to bring in a little bit of the esoteric readings that I've done, sounds a lot like gnosis. It also sounds a little bit like what Sri Aurobindo described as the supramental, or the higher mind. He has his own kind of he has his own tables, his own descriptions for this stuff. But it's again this way of expressing truth in a non-mental way by sort of being from it or being of it. And so everything that you are articulating is more of like an exfoliation or an exhalation of it. So I don't know. Is there a way to exfoliate or express or articulate or artistically? Or articulating is more of like an exfoliation or an exhalation of it. So I don't know. Is there a way to exfoliate or express or articulate? Hi, Amanda. I think that's Amanda.
Yeah. So Amanda, welcome. Glad you made it on. It sounds like you have another window open with maybe the YouTube or the video feed going, which is on a 30-second delay, and so that's feeding back in, and we're hearing ourselves recursively. So if you mute yourself or close that other window, then you'll be able to open back up and participate. Jeremy, there's a passage on 138 where I wrote down the word gnosis right next to it, and I didn't quite think that was right. I don't think he was quite talking about gnosis, and that's maybe that'll be a good question to ask. Like, is there a sort of mysticism inherent in where he's kind of taken us? Particularly in these pages, there seems to be. It sort of has that flavor, but at the same time, like, his attitude is not mystical. It's very judicious and kind of probing and careful. So there's no sort of release. There's no sort of ecstasy or kind of bliss experience that you might get or expect in the sort of Gnostic intuition. But he's talking about a knowledge. I'm going to read the words. It's page 138. A coming to terms is a purely rational process that is applicable to psychic processes. I don't know what the context of this is, but I'm getting to another line. And leads at best to either a magically accentuated unification or to a rationally directed reconciliation, which is in each instance a retrogression. Okay, now here's what I wanted to get to. For this reason, we again emphasize that integration, whether of four-dimensionality, of time, of mythical temporicity, or even to a certain degree of the unconscious itself, is not contingent upon our activity or passivity, but on our knowledge of the occurring process that we have gained by our detachment from it. Okay, now here's italicized. This knowledge is nearly synonymous with the phenomenon we have called the diaphanon, which is not bound to activity or passivity, light or darkness, but rather pervades or shines through them all. So that sort of getting beyond narrative, which is getting beyond the mythical, getting beyond the rational, ultimately, I think in his articulation of it here, in this chapter in particular, like, it leads back to what he's calling the diaphanon, which is basically a synonym for origin. And so what? That's the heart of the matter. That's what this is all about. And I don't think that there's one just experience that you could have of it. That kind of could be definitive. So to say more, I don't think I could quite say more about that. you know, part of what happens is that our narratives and our language leads us astray. You know, it leads us into these more constricted spaces, and the space beyond narrative, the space where one is experiencing origin, it's not constricted, right? I mean, the constriction happens in structure. The constriction happens from being embedded or reified in structure. But you know, to tie one thing in, I don't think I'm rambling here, but to tie, he talks about anxiety as being a kind of important almost symptom or expression of the movement of origin through structure and beyond structure. And that was one of the most helpful parts of the chapter for me, because I experienced a lot of anxiety, and it's very easy to fall into narratives around it, to fall into, like, I mean, that's almost essentially what happens, is like the anxiety, it fuels, you know, it kind of maintains certain narratives. And it was interesting to get his take on it, where he saw the anxiety as this kind of a narrowing that happens, a constriction that happens, which breaks through, which ultimately kind of comes out, like Di's comment earlier about her saying "shut up," like something kind of breaks through out of it, and maybe it's this kind of magical, impulsive thing, but it could also, I think, in my experience, can be these sort of mythical level ideas, you know, where I have these visions of what reality is about, or like a creative vision for a book or a project or a poem or something like that. Like something breaks through, but there's this anxiety that happens before then, and then for me personally, I have to meditate with it, or I have to do work with it, or I have to go into it in some way and sort of like explode it for something new to come forth, and for like my experience to go beyond the narratives that are kind of tied up in the anxiety.
I think it's relevant to where this is going, but diaphanous can actually mean transparent or translucent. And in these charts we get transparent, but to me transparent is you see through it to something else, whereas translucent, you remain in the whole itself. The light is in all of it. So the light is in the shut up, the light is in also the idea that I'm putting across, the light is in the feeling that I'm conveying when I say either the good or the bad. I don't know.
That's a great point. And you know, I know we mentioned this another week during one of the Hangouts, but you know, later in Gebser's life, when he was in India and Sarnath, he had this experience, and he also enjoyed a correspondence with D.T. Suzuki. Basically, it sounds a lot like this integral, or this realization, this structure of consciousness, to some degree is very similar to what at least Zen Buddhism was describing as this kind of, like you were saying, Marco, not a kind of ecstatic insight into the nature of reality, but of something that's calm and cool and seeing through and just sort of being the whole. And you know, just to reiterate, he described it as something that was sober, happening with crystal clarity, and that you know, there was no unearthly light, no ecstasy, no emotion, but a spiritual clarity, a quiet jubilation, a knowledge of invulnerability, a primal trust. And then he described himself as being recast at that point. This is in 1961, so good number of years after having written this. But I thought that was helpful for me to kind of, you know, this question of going beyond the narrative. Zach is saying it sounds like non-dual consciousness. It'd be kind of interesting to gain a little bit of a better understanding of Gebser's integral and sort of do a study of that as well. Because the non-dual might be another way that he was trying to describe a perspectival. I don't know. But, you know, non-dual, non-dual implies a certain set of linguistic assumptions. non-dualistic. And he goes into a very careful description in this book about why he chose a perspectival a little earlier in the book. So it might be worth revisiting that to kind of meditate on this word, non-dual versus a perspectival, if there is a similar. I think there is a connection here, though. So does anyone else want to chime in? We've had Kim and Amanda hop on.
And, oh yeah, and Donna as well, but we couldn't hear her before. Should we maybe just take a quick break and make sure everybody can, and then Amanda, you could we haven't even really been introduced. This is your first time on one of these Hangouts, so it'd be cool to hear how you got here and everything. But I just wanted to do a tech check-in and make sure that whoever wants to speak is able to, or if they're not, that they're getting help. Donna, are you okay there? Yeah, so we can't hear you. Have you? If Natalie is out there, Natalie is somewhere connected. I don't see her on my screen or anything, but she was trying to help people out.
So, yeah, I don't think Natalie can read the group chat in here. I don't know if there's a way.
And then just checking, Kim, are you technically set up?
Kim, are you good? Do you want to try to unmute real quick and just say hello?
Hello.
Okay, cool.
Good. But Donna, just really quick, before you change any of your other settings, if you see your video box, right above your video box, you'll see a couple of buttons. There's a mute microphone, turn camera off or turn camera on, adjust bandwidth, and then there's a little gear. Looks like a little gear icon. If you click on that, that shows your audio and your microphone settings. And you might be able to toggle that. You might be able to change something in there. Specifically your microphone settings. If you can switch it to something else and then click OK. Google's a little funny with this. We've experienced this a few times. Even for me, sometimes the microphone just decides not to work.
You know what you could also do, Donna? There's a chat window there, and it's on the left side of the window. If you hover over there, you'll see it's the top left one. It's like a blue icon it looks like a chat. Mm-hmm. And if you could find that, then you could participate that way.
You could also just hover share a screen and by work mode.
What does that say?
I'm on an iMac.
I'm an iMac. Oh, well, it should be working. I'm on a Mac. A lot of us are on Macs.
What browser? It won't work with Safari.
You might want to try Google Chrome if you got it. And if you don't, just make sure to close out of Safari first if you're going to try to log on through another browser.
I didn't know that either.
I've had trouble with Safari in the past as well, but not all the time. Sometimes it works. But I guess while we're waiting, hopefully, for Donna to hop back on with different browser, Amanda, do you want to chime in and just do a little intro and tell us how you got here and what brings you to be reading Gebser this winter?
Well, God, if only I remembered how I got here. My life has been so busy the last couple of weeks. I found one of you on, I think, Facebook. Do you do something called Reality Sandwich?
I do. I did. Yeah.
I think honestly it was just a series of coincidences, and I typed to Marco earlier today a little excerpt about just kind of I had been starting a reading group myself, and it kind of didn't. It was very new, and frankly, you're doing a much better job at it than what I was trying to do. My background, I studied a lot of philosophy quite a long time ago in undergraduate school, and I don't have the book yet, so I have not begun it. But these topics are really important to me. I was really interested. I've only sat in so far on one of your conversations, and I was just thoroughly engaged and impressed at the level of dialogue. I remember in one of the conversations I wanted to bring something popped into my head about Jung and his writings. So I'm kind of new to figuring out, I need to get the book and read it, so pardon me for not being up to speed like the rest of you. But I'm enjoying this, and very much so. So again, I just, I'm constantly sort of looking for reading groups. I'm involved in a group in Los Angeles here called Tongue and Groove, where writers read their work. Janet Fitch, who wrote White Oleander, was one of the readers recently. So it's a very high level of reading, and not necessarily just fiction. But I'm really thrilled at the idea of the fact that you're doing this particular book. It's a little hard to find, and my background, I have a master's in clinical psychology and have been working primarily in neurology and neuroscience at UCLA. I'm off kind of on a sabbatical right now, but we were doing an East-West study and working with some really interesting minds and a lot of philosophical, people who are not just compartmentalized as MDs. These were people who were very philosophical, and all of these topics, many of the topics that came up last week, we were really delving into and doing imaging of the brain, and in addition to that, and showing how the brain changes. We can see it and map it when people are meditating and praying, and it's just very fascinating with the conversation last week and the brilliant comments. I was so impressed with what so many of you were saying and contributing. But I'm new again and kind of trying to follow it, but I'm thrilled to be here.
Well, wonderful. Thank you for joining us. I'm so glad that you were able to find us.
Yeah, and just to reflect and maybe tie that back into the text, we were talking about how each structure kind of has its own qualities, and Gebser has, you'll see in the book when you get here, that there are these tables, and then on each table he'll go magic, mythical, mental, integral, and then lay out certain qualities that are associated with it. But one of the ones he brings up is that the magic structure, he says, like they're very interested in the entrails. It's very interested in the gut. And so one of the things that like magic cultures do is try to read the gut to understand reality, right? To understand, to tell the future, or whatever. But then he says that there's a correspondence at the mental structure, the mental level, with the brain, and that what the mental structure wants to do is to read the brain, and the brain kind of looks like guts, right? If you look at the structure, it's kind of this winding thing. It's not linear, so. And that just occurred to me as maybe a connection point, even though you haven't started reading the book. I think it's interesting that you're, even coming to it from the position of being involved in neurology and working specifically with the brain and consciousness. That's cool.
Yeah, it'll be really interesting to hear how you make connections with these structures and your own research and your own studies. So I'm really curious about that. We had someone I corresponded with who was writing about the structures of consciousness in the nervous system. So that was at the Integral Theory conference. I don't know if you're familiar with integral theory, and integral psychology, but they were tying that in that way, and there was some interesting things in that paper. I could send it to you afterwards if
I
you like to
love
check it out.
that. Thank
Yeah,
you. Mhm.
very very cool. So speaking of, there's just so much in this chapter that I don't really know how to progress, but
Can I ask a question?
please do.
Can we say more about measure and mass? Because I don't think I've actually grasped where he's heading with that.
That's tricky. I don't know if I really grasp it either quite yet. However, I got the point that he was making somewhere about midway through the chapter. Finally, that they have a kind of the pairing of measure and mass for each structure has to do with like the movements of each structure from the efficient, as he describes it, to the deficient aspect of it. So measure is the more kind of qualitative dimension, where the mass is the more quantitative. So when it goes into a deficient expression of itself, it becomes more, I guess you could almost say, like a dying star. It becomes inflated, becomes a red giant, and that becomes sort of the expansion, the mass of it. And that was my takeaway from it. And there's a lot of other interesting. I don't know if I didn't get it, or if he wasn't tying it in well, but he goes into language throughout this chapter as well, and specifically, the origins of words, and how the origins of words tend to have these sort of mirror meanings and polar ambiguities. And he seemed to be kind of going into that direction as well, kind of describing measure and mass as these kind of polarities in language. And I don't really know if I'm describing that accurately or not, but that's what I got from it. That's what I got from that kind of measure and mass description. I don't know if anybody else wants to chime in.
I was like, why are we talking about measure and mass? Where did that come from? It didn't seem to be like presaged in the text.
Yeah.
Unless I missed something, or unless it was like in some some footnote that I just neglected to read. So that was my first take, and I just went with them like, okay, we'll figure it out. I'll follow along. But yeah, they do share a root. I think that's one thing, and he seemed to think that there was some special significance to the fact that that they shared a root, but that they had these opposed meanings. Although that's itself not that clear, because when I think of something that's quantifiable, I think of measure. I don't think of it. I don't think of mass necessarily. And he was identifying measure with the efficient or the healthy aspect of a structure, kind of like measuredness, or in the sense of equilibrium, in the sense of balance, in the sense of proportion, perhaps might be another way of naming it. So, in a way, that sort of, he talks about deficient and efficient, and maybe this is one of the ways that he's beginning to define what that actually means. I have another question about efficient and deficient, but I don't want to go there.
He mentions it on page 129. The problem of measure, well, in number 1, because he has a couple of descriptions here. The problem of measure and mass presents itself in the form of a transition from moderation to augmentation and material aggregation. It appears here as an aspect of mass as seemingly a rational problem. But he goes into every structure and how it has to do with a psychic problem and then magical problem. But it has that kind of efficient play here, I guess. He was using it here, and it started to make sense here. But again, I'm not exactly sure. Like Mark,
I thought it corresponded maybe to what Wilbur talks about in terms of like holes and heaps. Where a hole is, some kind of some kind of structure that is integrated within itself, and a heap is just a jumble of things. And what happens, where he does go with this actually is he talks about the presence of the magic and the mythic in our world as being these masses, these things that are kind of not proportional, that are kind of out of control, and he goes into specific examples from his time, and then I started thinking of examples from our time, like the mythic, for example. He'll say that it moves into mass when there's just a preponderance of fantasy and like wishful thinking and like kind of getting lost in your images, getting lost in your stories or narratives, and like that's before that's when there was like 3 or 4 channels on TV and the radio, and that's kind of it. Like we have such a preponderance. I mean, you could Disney, for example. I mean, you could go if you had the money, spend all your time in these mythical worlds, that are not effective. They're not doing anything actually. They're just absorbing energy and consciousness. And that's like one of the other, I think, aspects of these. When something becomes mass or when something becomes deficient, it's like it absorbs energy, consciousness, and time, and it becomes sort of prevalent, but it's not actually doing anything. It's some kind of I don't know what to say. Distraction, I guess, is maybe one way of putting it. And I'll just say one more thing about that, because at the end of the chapter, he says this is when we first get our glimpse of like how this applies in our life, like how this might apply in looking at events in the world or phenomena, or how it might apply in our personal life. He starts to go there. It's interesting. Some of the language you can still hear if you go to like Integral Life, for example. Some of the kind of the language of applying it, of living an integral life as a kind of thing that you do. It's present in this chapter actually. So
yeah, he has some personal descriptions in here about. Let's see if I can find them. You know what I'm talking about, Marco? Like how, like sort of bring yeah, okay. So on page 132, first he goes into a really interesting description of psychology and magic and technology, and he makes an interesting connection again with the language. All making, whether in the form of spell casting or the reasoned technical construction of a machine, is an externalization of inner powers and conditions, and as such their visible outward form. I thought that was really neat. I've kind of heard that before from Jung, actually bringing up Jung. He talks a lot about this. But he mentions the integral in the sense that, towards the bottom of the page, he says integration is only possible if the projection is retracted, and retraction can be realized only out of a new consciousness structure. Psychic projections can be undone only by the conscious mental understanding. I don't know if he means mental structure here, but does this perhaps suggest that the material physical projections can be resolved through integrating the spiritual capacity of diaphany? And he kind of leaves that as a question. But then he says, be that as may, in any event, resolving the problem of technology, a problem which cannot be solved merely by further technological advancement. But again, technology is this mass, this aggregation, this kind of limitless attempt to overcome the world or overcome the problems through more of itself. But I thought that was an interesting point here, and he mentions it a little bit later too about kind of like bringing in all of your projections personally, and I thought that was pretty interesting too, more of a personal description of it. But I see we have Lauren on. Last time, Lauren, your microphone wasn't working. Do you want to try again? You want to try to say hello? No. I don't know. I don't know what's up with that. We were mentioning before, some people have had trouble with Macs with Safari. I don't know if you use Safari as your browser, but if you're not, you could try to use Google Chrome. Yeah. Well, if not, Skype isn't open. You're saying, okay, you are using Chrome. Well, Google is kind of an enigma, apparently. All right. Well, hopefully we'll get it working at some point.
I feel so bad.
Me too. I just feel so powerless to help in front of being.
I wanted to try and pick up on something that Marco said, that the magic doesn't do anything. Is that what you said, Marco?
Yeah, not that it itself is not doing anything, but what Gebser talks about is the mass or the deficient aspects of structures, like when they become deficient, when they become kind of ineffective. I think that. Yeah, I don't know. What did you? Where are you going?
Well, I was wanting to go. You know, I pretend that my dead cat, who went to Mars, changes the traffic lights for me. So when I'm in stressful traffic conditions, actually having a magic cat somehow does something within my being. So there is a doing.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that the mental structure has lost is the use of the imagination. And the imagination and magic, to me, are closely related. Probably not philosophically, but yeah. It sounds trivial, but it actually changes the way I drive.
I hope for the better.
Yes, definitely.
There's an interesting connection here too, and this is also Jungian and its relationship. But we're talking about Disney World and Disney and fantasy and the sort of. Gebser mentions in this chapter the like unbridled interest in images with film. Like he's basically saying like cinema is this like deficient mythical thing, and I thought that was kind of funny because I totally disagree with that. I think it can be, but it's interesting though because he's saying that all of these different structures are coming online and offline, and as we go along, we kind of lose some intensities and potencies of spirituality or consciousness or proximity to origin. But at the same time, I think it's interesting that all of this stuff, the magic and the mythical, fantasy, movies, and the relationship between this deficient mental rational consciousness, this technological consciousness that we have today, and magic and fantasy and myth have a very strong connection, and they seem to be erupting in our time today. Not necessarily because they're deficient, but because we've so suppressed them that they kind of overtake, our culture. They captivate us. Disney World captivates us, and technology captivates us because we've so disowned it in ourselves. We've so repressed it that it almost comes to dominate us in a kind of ironic way. So I find there's another interesting dimension to the structures where perhaps the mental being the most remote and the most dimensionalized and the most spatialized, the most concretized in terms of just like being here in the physical, spatial, whatever. Because of that, all of these other structures kind of poke and prod and almost manipulate in an unconscious way the mental, its desires. We seek immortality, we seek powers, we seek the imagination, but we can only do it through the technological. So we're kind of outering these things without owning them. And Gebser has this great statement where he describes this consideration points to the limits of technology, for technology is definitely unable to bestow on man the omnipotence which he imagines himself to have. On the contrary, technology necessarily leads to an impotence to the extent that the process of physical projection is not realized. So I really like that.
I'm sure that was better in German.
I'm sure.
Impotence. Do you think there's a kind of like a high culture? Do you think there's a little snobbery in Gebser?
Maybe a little bit. I don't. He wasn't writing. All of these guys, they write during their time, and then they say like, oh well, the emergent generation isn't so with it. But he wasn't totally like that, because he does write in the foreword to the book that like the hippie generation gets what I'm talking about. He mentions that. So I just think it takes to some degree of somebody born in the generation of the media that they're using to kind of really get the nuances of it and the complexities and the pros and the cons. If that makes sense, because all of us are connected here through the internet, but you could argue that the internet is just this this deficient form of the mental, in some ways. And it's interesting because he mentions in this chapter one of the last tables, in here that the deficient integral, which I hadn't thought of that much before, is a void, an atomizing dissolution. And Douglas Rushkoff just came out with this article recently about new media and Trump, and how Trump is this like perfect presidential candidate for the internet age, in the same way that Ronald Reagan was for the television age, because of how atomizing the internet can be with identity. And even though we have this proliferation of new forms of identity, there's a kind of digitization of it so that there's no more ambiguity. Like each pixel has a certain mathematical point and description. So there can be a lot of complexity, but everything finally gets pixelated and numbered and numerified, so to speak. So I don't know. I think it's a mix of things. It's not just good or bad. And Gebser probably couldn't see that because he just wasn't living in this eruption of new media that we're in today. But I'd be so intensely curious what he would think of our art today, and like digital art and music. So just so curious about what he would think about the whole internet age as a phenomenon.
You mentioned, can you hear me? Sorry. Also, I have a question. Before, when people were talking, I saw them on the big screen, and now I only see Lauren. Did something shift?
Click her box again, and it'll go back to like automatically focusing on the person who's speaking.
It just says profile ignore muted on her box.
You can just kind of click it. If you click it and there's a white border around it, then it'll focus on her. And then if you just unclick the box, not the arrow, just like in the middle of the box, then it'll focus on whoever's talking.
Oh, okay. Sorry, everybody. No, I was interested in you had made a comment about film, and you stated that he said something about Jeremy, that he said something about film that you kind of disagreed with, but when we put it into the context of when he wrote this, which is in the 40s and 50s, are you taking that into context? Do you know what film was like then compared to what it's like now? I was just kind of curious about that comment that you had. Again, not having read the text yet.
Oh, that's a good point. To some degree, I am just based on my readings of Marshall McLuhan and what he was writing about around that time as well. I do think that there's a kind of mythical resurgence, but it's not. I wouldn't describe the 1940s, 1930s, and the emergence of cinema as necessarily something deficient. I think it was something that Marshall McLuhan has this interesting description that might tie in here, because Gebser's going, kind of going with these polarities and these opposites in this chapter, but he uses the word enantiodromia, which I think also Jung uses. A thing becomes its opposite. So the linearity of film, of segmented linear, frames moving in a direction from left to right or whatever, moving in a linear direction, sped up enough becomes a sort of opposite, where instead of becoming just a linear progression, film can have this kind of nonlinear and imagistic and mythical quality to it. So it becomes not hyper-rational, but perhaps mythical, and it sort of retrieves the mythical, and it retrieves the imagination in a way that print media couldn't.
Do you mean by just the technology of it, not the imagination?
But then the art as well, I think.
Because if I think of a film like Pan's Labyrinth or something, I don't know. I maybe I'm not following where you're going with that.
Just like the medium of film itself, and Gebser's saying like the use of, and I guess for him it was a novelty in the 50s and the 40s, this idea of moving pictures. He's saying was a kind of deficient resurgence of myth, of the mythical consciousness.
Okay. Wow.
And I think that's what he was saying, so that's why my own reaction to it was kind of, I don't know, because.
That's really it's fascinating to think of that and think of it in the context of where cinema was at that time. It's interesting. I see that.
Mm-hmm.
Jeremy, you mentioned something about the internet potentially being a deficient form of the rational. Did I hear that?
Yeah, of the rational, and then I also kind of just made a little link to his table there where he describes a deficient form of the integral as void and atomization into dissolution.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought that was kind of an interesting thing too.
I think just on the internet comment, because Marco posted this in the chat as well, in terms of a technology medium. And I mentioned something about Hillary Clinton. This was in 2009, 2010, Secretary of State. She made a comment about the internet being a nervous system for the planet. And this was during the time of Avatar when that was coming out. And I happened to be living in Beijing at that time, and the government freaked out about the movie, and it was pretty funny. And then their internet policy as well. So the internet in China is actually, my research topic is in my graduate studies. So I'm fascinated by kind of like our own sort of wrestling to try and understand it and what it's offering. And my question to what you brought up is, I can get the atomizing in terms of, if I'm understanding that part correctly, is sort of like just like supreme relativism, atomizing in the sense of like binary code and just that, which is kind of fun to think about, just this alternating, void, fullness as the, sort of a Morse code of what this digital medium sort of expands into, in a limited sense, right? Because it's on a screen or whatever. And also just the individual presence, how it can be, I think, marginalized or relativized or polarized to its own reality. So in a sense, like what you were talking about in terms of, Marco was talking about in terms of Disneyland being an ultimate distraction, right? So you can also, on the internet, just surround yourself with people that agree with you and block everyone on Facebook that you don't like. Or you can, to me, it's more of a reflection of the mental structure of the person who's using the medium or engaged in a relationship with the internet. I don't know why I say it that way, but
engaged in a relationship. Okay.
Like I used to joke that the internet was, basically for retarded people that had no sensitivity to like their own consciousness extended, like, it's like a really great sort of slow way for humans to actually learn how to connect and very concretely like use words and use all the things that our senses are used to, without a regression to magical, like, telepathic and all that stuff that he talks about. But in a way, it's almost sort of like, that sense of like I'm sitting there and, I sit there and all of a sudden I notice that, I get a really strong sensation in my body somewhere, and then, 30 seconds later I get a text message from a particular person. And for me, that's a regular occurrence, and I used to dismiss it as magical. But what I'm beginning to sort of notice with the internet, with my phone, with immediate feedback, and I've actually trained myself to be more aware of the sensation of certain people who are really focusing their consciousness on me intently in that moment. And so it's almost like a feedback, a slow feedback drip of like confirmation that there is that connection, there is that felt experience in my awareness. For me, I feel it in my physical body. I don't know like how and if other people have that. But so some of these technologies, for me, if we're paying attention, we get another sort of dimensionality or a hint at that I think we can be discerning about and not magical. I think there's a huge risk of that. For me, the internet is like a really great kind of like, intermediary sort of technology for really developing what capacities we might engage in, like how could we evolve from this, or how could we mutate from this? Like that's really just like exciting to me because I have no idea. But I see little hints like, ooh, that's cool, but like I don't know, I don't think I'll live to see like, X-Men or anything living on the planet. But yeah, for me, the internet I think can be viewed from the rational and like and crushed there, or I think there's another way of looking at it where it's just constructive, but still could lead to the destruction of the planet too, because Donald Trump meme gets, totally blasted out there, and whatever happens with his hair, I don't know, but you know what I'm saying. So it's like I have kind of like a curiosity about it, but I have a sense that it's just part of like a necessary part of like this emerging sort of, whatever it is. And to it, I wonder, just from what everyone's comments are, in terms of reading this so far, do you have an idea of your own space or development, like where you're at? Like, has it challenged you in any way to really rethink or bring clarity to how you experience structures? So yeah, so sorry, that's kind of 2 in 1, but that's what I'm really curious about, is like, what in the hell are people experiencing right now when they're reading this? I'm like, Marco mentioned anxiety, and I'm like, oh yeah. Thank you. Thanks for putting face to that.
You covered so many topics in that. I want to go back to, I'm curious about the kind of the jargon being used here. We're using the word magical a great deal, and it seems like it's being used in replacement of just intuition. So is that because this is how he, in the book, is referring to? Because in psychotherapy, it's again, in some of the studies we did, intuition has been, this is a real thing. It's not a magical thing that doesn't exist. People can go into rooms, and they've done studies with.
Just to stop you before you riff too bad, yeah, he uses it in a very specific way in defining a structure, so it's relevant to the conversation, understand how he's contextualizing it historically.
And also that magic, he's not putting it down. He's not saying that magic is unreal or fake. Like, he's saying that magic actually works within the sort of world of magic, but so that world is part of our world.
So he's including intuition. He's calling intuition magic.
Well, more than intuition, also emotion, impulse, the sort of magical thinking, or some, like language is a kind of really magical, because the idea that you say something and something happens, or spells, magic spells, that kind of a thing, like that is preserved is partly what he's saying in the magic structure. So intuition is definitely part of that, and he's definitely saying that it's real and present. It's active, but that it could have, and this is where the conversation I think was going, is it could have these different expressions that, and he distinguishes between what he calls deficient and efficient, and it's a weird thing for me. Like, I'm trying to understand how I even feel about that, like to divide phenomena between like good or bad. In a way, it's like, to me, it's like good or bad. If it's deficient, it's bad. It's sort of dying. If it's efficient, it's good. It's like healthy and unhealthy. And so, like, talking about the internet and about movies and about media, I think there's this feeling that it's like too much of it is bad. Like, I have kids, for example, and we limit how much how much screen time they have. My daughter can't be on the iPad all day. It's a special thing. We don't have the TV on all the time, and that's because partly of the sense that all that imagery, all those influences, and it's almost like the media itself. It's not even like the content, because they could be watching Mr. Rogers all day, and we would still think that's bad, right? We would still think that was feeding some sort of deficiency. I don't know. And where do we really make those judgments from? That's kind of like my question. That's why I asked if anybody thought, or Jeremy, if you thought that Gebser was a little bit snobby.
I like his distinction of efficient and deficient. I just don't really think that when he's using this for other structures other than the mental, which is the current sort of humanism and the scientific revolution, he's talking about our own civilization. And when he's talking about our own civilization, I think it's the most applicable. But when he's saying like, oh, and the Aztecs were this deficient, mythical or magical, I just I don't think he has much grounds to claim that, especially because he was writing. 50, 60 years ago.
He really went after, though, I think even more so than the other structures, magical being dangerous. And to the point of not even wanting to go into too much detail around it because it could have a negative. And I see it with a lot of my friends that are kind of stuck in the new age, and I sit and listen to them around their experience, and I know they're having a useful experience with what they're doing or the work they're doing. But like my spiritual teacher would say, don't stop and pick up the flower on the side of the road. Those might be gifts or skills, or those realms of spirit might exist, but don't get distracted, keep going, type of thing. And so when I read some of his caution around wanting to go too far down that was my curiosity. Is like, why is he emphasizing not just a deficient form of magic, but going as far as to say it's a dangerous thing to even really entertain too much of, as if it will like open a portal like Ghostbusters or something.
I think that has something to do with probably his own times, going back to his historical context, seeing, and this also ties into maybe his critique of cinema, the rise of fascism in Europe and extreme nationalism. He saw as these kind of resurgence of magical and mythical thinking in its deficient forms.
Kind of like if you go, it's the whole Book of Mormon joke about if you go have sex with a frog or a virgin baby, then you'll not get AIDS type of magical thinking, like that type of thing.
I don't know. I don't know.
But that's the same type of thing. Or like when I was in China, they like shave kids' heads, all kinds of weird stuff, and you're like, why do they do that? Oh, well, they don't have any hair in this patch, then they won't get napped by the devil. Like that kind of stuff still exists today.
That's
not intuition.
What Gebser seems to say that, and again, I don't really agree with him completely, just due to modern anthropology, but he often kind of throws this at like, all of the contemporary indigenous people don't really have the original efficient magical and mythical whatever because of that and they're more superstitious these days. I don't think he had really access to the anthropology, because I think he would have found a lot of interesting, efficient, according to his definitions, aspects of this. But all of this jargon, it's basically, when you read the book, it'll make more sense. But he's going across in the first couple of chapters that we've been gone over these different structures which have a relationship to space and time and different qualities, and he was able to codify in his writing the archaic, the magic, and the mythical, and the magical specifically, Marco was mentioning about emotion and volition and spells and that kind of thing, but it's also kind of like a unity with the world, a sense of timelessness and that kind of thing. But then the mythical is a sense of cyclical time and more agricultural societies and polarities, mythical polarities of light and dark and complementarity. So these are kind of things that are just part of our makeup, historically speaking, culturally speaking. And it's difficult, for me at least, to distinguish the two, just because if you go back enough, I'm just thinking of a book like Hamlet's Mill. I don't know if anybody's read Hamlet's Mill, but it's a book that goes into these old myths, but then it actually claims that these myths are probably older than civilization and that our study of the stars goes way, way back. So the sense of cyclical time and astrology and myth probably is prehistoric in its origins. So the mythical and the magical kind of almost sound interdependent and certainly emergent, but Gebser is basically saying that anytime this stuff comes back in the modern world, it's not coming back in a healthy form, and that was his caution. And
do you think that's true though? Like with
I don't. I think it's
because the polarity thing. Like I know, like Bert Parley, he's here in Dallas, and he just gave a class on polarity management. And Stephen McIntosh talks a lot about polarity in his book that we're reading right now, as like a natural force. It's just part of the universe, like magnetism. And so when I was thinking in terms of how McIntosh is talking about polarity versus how Gebser tends to kind of like put it in that structure, but then he's also saying, well, those structures exist, but I kind of struggled with that particular one, right? Because it's a really good example of polarity. So it's like that, and but it's different than duality, right? And that third perspective he's talking about rationally, where you can kind of like, mentally kind of look at these two things. because you have that capacity. But I don't know, I got really stuck on the whole idea of metabolism and sort of like faking your way in one like structure and using like the thing about St. Augustine talking about using so much energy in that structure by, you know, polarizing to one side of it, or kind of, I imagine like that would be like someone who's doing a lot of ego work but actually hasn't like, you know, sort of transcended the ego, and so they do a lot of ego work and they have to just use a shitload of energy on their quote spiritual path because they're constantly managing their ego with their ego as opposed to actually like taking that next step. And to me, I wondered if that was like metabolism at the mental. But that polarity thing kind of just kept coming up for me because there's almost like a sense or a feeling of magnetism and polarity that way as a natural force, so I could relate to that. So I was kind of having a hard time with seeing how that would be a deficient thing in any way unless it was just overemphasized in an unhealthy way. So those were kind of, you know, where I get stuck at understanding how they exist but don't exist, but the healthy form and unhealthy form, and just that's not clear at all.
But I mean, even today, like the past 400 years of scientific revolution, this would all fit into his deficient, and it's clearly not all bad, you know. So I don't know. I think Marco does have a point that like just cutting the line there and saying, all right, at this point, everything this structure is doing is going to shit. You know, I don't think that's completely. I don't think he intended.
Maybe it's more like the caution flag, just to say, oh, if you do too much of this.
Yeah, because there's really interesting things that we're doing with technology and the internet. You know, Zach was mentioning like how much does a medium affect us back, and how much is it sort of a tool like you're mentioning to kind of reflect our own sort of orientation, our own center of gravity, consciousness-wise. You know, I don't think it's neat and linear. I think it's very complex. And later on in the book, he kind of describes something that I go back to when this question comes up, which is that, you know, these transformations of consciousness are Janus-faced, in that they're really sort of a mix of the older structure and then this new structure, this new reality that's kind of breaking through it. But the older structure, it's going to kind of run with it until it can't anymore. And there's probably these micro transformations and these microstructures in between these big ones.
Yeah.
So, I mean, and he even mentions at the beginning of the book, there was probably like a later magical, earlier magical. Like, I'm sure that the same thing with mental and the same thing with the deficient mental. There's probably a series of things we can kind of distinguish. And the digital age is certainly one of these really interesting, like, you can really see it as this beautiful, you know, world coming together, unity, diaphany, transparency, interconnectivity, and the nervous system, like McLuhan associates the internet with the nervous system and sort of a holistic, whole-oriented thing. It wasn't around for the internet, but electronic culture. And you could see it that way, but you could also see it as hyper-atomizing, and everybody has their own identity and their own worldview, and they're just going to kind of fill into that and be disconnected from each other. So you could see it as both, and I think it's accurate to say that it is both, because it's reflecting where we are right now. We're trying to go towards this, orient ourselves towards this wholeness, but we're doing it with the consciousness that's not quite there. So we're creating some awesome stuff and really problematic, flawed stuff at the same time, and it's just transformative and deficient and efficient. And it's just reality just exploding, you know. So
can you talk just a little bit about the psyche and mental? I think it's like the equilibrium there. Like, I think I have again more of a sense of psyche than an actual grasp on the meaning in relationship to the mental and that balance.
Sorry, could you repeat that? The psyche and the mental?
Yeah. Like, because he talks about how there's the ratio, like, I think he uses several different things. This is on just the end of the last chapter, and then it pokes its head up in here too, like, and the mental, he talks about like some sort of like the psyche and relationship, like maybe just start with defining or maybe can you talk a little bit about psyche as he's describing it?
Well, I know he uses psyche to describe mostly. Anybody can chime in here. The mythical, right? So the sort of mental imagistic picture is the psyche, and the psyche is related to the soul. So I know he's used it that way. I'm not sure if he really uses it directly to describe the mental.
I would think it was like more in relationship or some kind of balance there.
I think I could put it in very just kind of layman's terms, which is like the mental will have the tendency to think it's figured things out, like to think I know what I'm doing, I know why I'm doing what I'm doing, I have my reasons, I have my justifications, my rationalizations, and to believe that what I think is what's real, and what I think is actually what's determining my experience and my actions. And the psychic is all that realm of what to the mental would be unconscious phenomena, like my dreams, my history, my wounds, my traumas, all that sort of psychological stuff, but also the somatic, obviously part of that. And it's like to the mental that doesn't acknowledge the immensity and the power, and also the kind of the ultimate incomprehensibility of the psychic, then it'll think that it's doing things for its own reasons. But when there's a relationship, when there's sort of a letting the psychic be psychic, which has to include these other structures. I mean, the mythical, for one, the stories that we have tell ourselves and tell others, and then the magic, the intuition aspects that Amanda mentioned earlier, and lets them be what they are, and doesn't presume that it has all the answers, that it actually knows what's going on. I think that's where then there could be some balance, there could be some measuredness or some integration there. And that was an interesting passage in the book as well, because he's talking about the unconscious, and it's like from the perspective of the mental, you have to figure out the unconscious. Like you have to get in there and interpret it and figure out what it means. What does the dream mean? What do you really feel like? There has to be articulated in some way, in some rational, some mental terms. Whereas what he's saying, in my interpretation, is that not my interpretation. It's just like I think what he's saying is that that you just have to let the unconscious be the unconscious. Like just let that reality be what it is, without trying to impose a specific meaning on it, which would only be coming from that mental plane.
Historically, in some ways, that's basically the sort of eruption of psychology in, the early 20th century, late 19th century, and maybe Amanda could probably speak to this a little bit too. Just the interesting, sudden fascination with the unconscious and these drives and these emotions, and then of course with Jung and dreams and sort of this living. What do Jung call it? The reality of the psyche.
Hello?
Or psychic reality.
It works.
Oh, Lauren.
Okay,
Hi.
I'll chime in later.
Well, that was just my point. I don't know if Amanda, you wanted to respond or articulate that any further, but that's sort of how I understand it. That this sort of mental, conscious, waking mind, which becomes almost, it believes it's self-sufficient. It wants to kind of control things, but there's so much more to who and what we are that if we repress that, if it's out of balance, it can kind of break forth into our life and make us feel like we've lost control, even though we were never in control to begin with.
I don't know if I have anything to chime in at the moment on that, but clearly I think Jung's work would have had an impact, and I keep thinking of archetypes that Jung, spoke of so often, and these especially with the collective unconscious. But I'm still kind of trying to follow the thread of some of these comments here. So right now,
Gebser knew Jung. They hung out together, right?
Yeah, at the Iranos lectures or conferences. He knew him towards the end of Jung's life. But Yeah. Lauren, did you want to chime in now? Yeah, we're coming up at the end, but it would be great if to hear from you a little bit before we close.
So let's see. Can you hear me well?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm not sure. We've been talking about some interesting things tonight. Let's see. Yeah, okay. God, I don't really have like a specific thing right in my mind at this moment that I want to say, but
Well, how about just like your personal, like you are a student, CIS?
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah. So I got to take a class. I was a student there. I got my master's. I did take a class on Jean Gebser and with Eric Weiss. One of the things that I think is interesting that we were talking about actually is so we're noticing that we're very much still in this deficient mental, but at the same time we're seeing the integral emerging. And so one of the things that I found interesting in Eric's class was this idea that when each one of the mutations is forming, it's sort of like this arc, right? And as it's getting to its peak, we become like comfortable in our creations from that consciousness structure, and then in that becomes this like stagnancy with what we're creating, and there's a need for something new, and it starts to become deficient, and in that downward turn of this arch, the new mutation is born and starts emerging. So we're seeing, there's like multi-layers of the structures in our experience, and some of us may be experiencing more of one consciousness than another, perhaps, habituating towards more of one than another. And I feel like somebody said that the internet today is like atomizing us, and but at the same time it's bringing this global awareness and bringing us together. So we're experiencing simultaneously this efficient integral and this deficient integral. And how are we going to balance those in our lives and be able to see, I guess, a wider, a freedom of structure altogether?
I wish I was able to take that Eric Weiss class. That sounds
Yeah.
awesome.
Yeah, he's
Thank
great.
you. Thanks for chiming in. I hope you're able to chime in next
Yeah,
time as well.
I hooked up a mic, so now I have
So that's what
that
okay.
works.
I see.
Yeah.
It just reminded me what you said. Nathan Homan is also one of our participants. He's not here right now. I don't think he might be listening, but he quoted Gebser later on in the book on page 181. The ruins which themselves contain the basis for the new.
Exactly.
So, on that note, I think we should probably wrap it up. We're about 15 minutes over. But yeah, I just want to thank everybody for participating tonight or tomorrow, depending on where you're from. And yeah, we'll see everybody next week for week 4. And we'll be meeting again on Tuesday and Thursday as well. Is that right? Or are we coming around?
Yeah, we're doing it.
We got one more before the break, right?
And then there's going to be a catch-up week after that.
Yeah.
Cool.
So take advantage to get another 20 or 30 pages in.
Yeah.
That's how long it's in.
He's done.
Yeah, so that was cool. That was good. I want to talk more about what makes something efficient and what makes something deficient.
Yeah, I think that's a good topic.
Like I feel a little bit uncomfortable with those divisions because it can so easily be seen differently.
It's almost like he's being sort of deficient mental by dualizing things.
Mm-hmm.
That's a very good point.
Who said that? I didn't see the. Was
Lauren.
that Lauren?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Zach said dense or convoluted or early integral. He's writing this. But we're going over, and I know we're trying not to go over as much. We're trying to have this mental.
It's so hard to stop talking about it, though.
It is.
Yeah, and you're getting all pent up, not even being able to talk. Just like got your mouth. You just got.
I'm just curious, where is everybody located? Are most of you on the East Coast?
I'm on the East Coast.
I'm in Colorado.
Oh, Colorado.
Yeah.
Lauren,
Zach,
where are you from?
Portland.
California.
Zach, can you disclose your location? You look like you could be in an underground bunker somewhere.
I live in
He is in Portland, you know.
Do y'all see my friend over here? This is my magic.
It does look like a bunker.
You're not with those guys holding out against the government, are you?
Actually, I'm in Oregon, so I was thinking about sending them over, but they're too busy enacting a deficient sense of the rational.
Yeah. Maybe a little bit of the pathological as well.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. All right.
Thanks, Lauren. It was finally great to hear from you.
Yeah, I know. I'm so happy that I get to chime in now. So I'll talk to you guys all next week.
Yeah, join us next time.
Marco, I want you to think about one thing. The efficient and deficient, we keep putting it in like social structures or things, but I want to think about that in terms of the people ourselves. Like, how are we experiencing that in our own development that's deficient or not? Right? Instead of looking at the things outside of us all the time, it's like we keep talking in those terms. It seems like the internet. And I'm like, what the fuck is that? Like,
Yeah, I think that's a nice.
I keep doing
challenge.
that all the time. I feel like I keep bringing it back to like, well, what are you experiencing? And everyone's
Yeah,
I'm like, come
absolutely.
on, guys.
It's like you're making it real. So that's good. I think we should go there. You know, why not?
Or maybe
We're all just getting, we all have to wear some mask somewhat. Yeah, that's a whole nother conversation. That's chapter. That's the previous chapter, I think. But
that's true. That is.
What if? I think that would be interesting. Like, it would be interesting to see, like, to kind of just do a maybe practice where you feel like, can you feel origin? Like, can you feel origin as you're speaking? Can you feel origin as you're listening? You know, that kind of a thing.
Can you
And
feel
just
it?
and just see if like there could be some mutual, some sort of field of co-presence or something like that. That'd be cool.
Yeah, because it's like we're like sharing these beautiful mental structures at each other, and yet I feel like there's this other thing wanting to kind of connect and just be acknowledged. So. Maybe that's my magical. I don't know, but yeah.
Yeah, I feel it too.
That's sweet.
Cool. Well,
All
until
right.
next time, everybody.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.
So much. Have a good night.
It's such a pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us.
You're welcome. Bye, Lauren.
Bye-bye.